Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Peter. I am the technical backup for the meeting, so I will mainly be hiding behind the screens and hand over the session to Dan in a couple of seconds. From my side, I just wanted you to give two basic instructions as to how to use the platform. First of all, this is a webinar system with simultaneous translation. So that means that you can listen to the language of your choice. You will find the language box under the slides on the right-hand side where it says your language at the bottom of the screen. Just select your language and start listening to the interpretation, and also you can then also see the slides in your own language. In case you want to ask questions to the speakers, you can use the chat channel. Under my image, you see that you have a general chat and a question chat, and you can type general chat. Dan will then collect is if you have any technical problems with your connection or your sound or anything whatsoever. On the left hand, on the bottom of the screen, in the black box, there is a question mark. If you click on that question mark, you can talk to us, to the technical support, and we will solve your problem as soon as we can. So just type your question in the chat and we will help you. So that's all from my side. I will now leave the meeting to our chairman, Mr. Dan Robben. Dan, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, very much. First of all, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome all to this fifth webinar in the We Do and Both Ends series on women's rights and climate finance. As Peter mentioned, my name is Dan Robben, and I work for Both Ends, which is a Dutch NGO based in Amsterdam, as a climate finance policy officer, and I'm part of the observer team, civil society observer team that follows GCF Green Climate Fund processes. As Peter mentioned, I'll be the moderator of the day, and also part of the organizational team, and very important part of the organizational team is Tara Daniel. She's at We Do, and she's currently in New York. So what's on the program for today? So today's program consists of three great women that engage in climate finance. Before I properly introduce them, I will just introduce them shortly. Ms. Massam Dalmaida, she's the founding president of HOSE, and I probably pronounced that wrong, so I hope she can correct me. That's the Francophone Women's Fund, and she's based in Lomé, Togo. Then we have Mrs. Maria Julia Tramutola, and she's the Director of International Development. That's from FARN. That's a Foundation for Environment and Natural Resources based in Argentina. And we have Wanun Permpibul. She's the Director of Climate Watch in Thailand. So today we have the privilege to listen to the experiences of these three great women's rights activists from all over the world, but they have one thing in common. They are engaging in climate finance processes, and they are going to share their views and perspectives on how their experience is. Some context before we start. I hope this works. Can you all hear me? I hope so. See someone commenting. So this webinar series is the fifth in a row, and it is part of a joint project that We Do and Both Ends. Both Ends as part of the GAGA Alliance, the Global Alliance for Green and Gender Action, is doing, and it's supported by the Wallace Global Fund. The project is called Women Demand Gender Just Climate Finance, and it's focused on creating awareness, improving capacities, and increasing access to climate finance decision-making processes and climate finance funds for women's rights, gender, and feminist organizations. In this project, we started to looking at climate finance processes focused on the Green Climate Fund, as we will explain later, as our speakers of the day will explain later. It's a start. It's not everything, but it's a start, and we were engaged already in this process, so that's why we chose this alley. One of the components of this of this project, is organizing webinars. So, as I said, we had already 4 webinars, and I can briefly show you around those webinars. So the first one was an introduction to climate finance that took place in December 2017. In February 2018, we had the privilege to have a speaker from Heinrich Böll Foundation, Liane Schalatek, who is a great expert on gender in climate finance mechanisms. Then in March 2018, we had experience of people actually trying to access the money from climate finance mechanisms. So not only decision making, but also getting access to the funds. And on the fourth webinar, which took place in June 2018, we had great presentations on strategies for organizing to influence, monitor, and track climate finance. Interesting to know is that all webinars and presentations can be found either on YouTube or on the website of WeDo, and the link is in the PDF or in the presentation here. So you can always look them up later. So what are we going to do today? Today we are. Let me go back to the program. Today we're going to listen to three great women that are linked to our project, and they will explain themselves how. And how we're going to do this, we have three presentations lined up from 10 to 15 minutes, followed by a space for questions, clarifying questions on each presentation. I encourage you to ask questions. This is meant to be a session where we have interaction, and you can ask the questions in the chat box, and we will pick them up. After the three speakers are done, we open up the floor for more general questions, comments, or insights or thoughts, and we welcome again everybody to be active. So I already said questions can be raised in the chat box, and the translation is also explained already. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to the first speaker, Massan Dalmaida, who is with us today from Lomé, Togo. So please, can you give the floor to Massan?
Je dois parler en français. Donc, mon nom c'est Massan Dalmeda. Je suis la présidente de ROEC. C'est le fonds pour les femmes.
I'm going to speak French. I'm Massan Dalmeda. I am the president of WASA. This is the Francophone Women's Fund. And what does that mean? That means we believe in something. So I have been taking part in the project, as Dan said. And I represent Africa on the platform within the regional African group to observe and track the process of green funds in Africa. And I am Francophone, and I wanted to speak in French, so I'm going to speak a little bit about me and my activism and the reasons why I am engaged in climate activism. I am also going to speak about the role of women's organizations in this process, and before going on to what we are doing at African level within the process and the challenges that we are overcoming with our own resources. So I started to work on the question of women's rights when I was young, nearly 20 years ago. I started with the questions of gender and women on a national level before moving on to regional, national and international levels before entering into the process of green action and climate change, because throughout my activism within different organizations, I saw that there were very few organizations which... Okay, so I'm going to slow down a bit for the interpreter to be able to follow. So I am saying, so my engagement in questions of the environment and climate change comes from the fact that I saw that there was very few women's organizations in the Francophone space which worked in this sector. Even when we looked in the English-speaking world within women's movements, when we looked at the number of organizations which followed these process, we had very few militants involved in these process. So that is why there is our engagement, and in this project which looked at those perspectives, the outlooks to militate for women's questions, and the point of view in the process for the green and gender action and climate finance in general. So what we're trying to do across the African group is to mobilize ourselves and organize women's groups to engage in this process as we have the opportunities to move forwards, specifically in questions related to climate. It's a much larger question, and there are lots of other mechanisms related to our activities which we are trying to follow. One of the main reasons for engaging in this process is because we saw that finance had been reduced because it was redirected. The global finance was redirected towards other topics, and the main topics which it has been directed to is questions about climate change and the map towards the way that we live on a daily basis in order to understand and ensure that these are implemented within projects and programs to reduce the inequalities related to women. I think that we are going to have to invest ourselves to militate for projects in this sector as women, and not only among people who just shout when things are going wrong, but we need to start to go further and be active in terms of the way these are implemented. When we talk about this, there are lots of opportunities to act. The history of our militancy has concentrated a lot on advocacy questions and activities, lobbying activities, and we are there to raise what has not been done correctly beforehand in terms of projects and programs which we are implementing to track the process internationally, to discuss the prospects for women at this level. I think that we need to consider critically, with respect to the results we are starting to see, compared to the engagement and the investment that we are putting into this work. This is because if you look at what we're doing, you can see it is important not to identify what has been badly done, but what is most important for us is positive change, and these which must be caused by these actions in the field. So if lobbying and advocacy are important, it is also important for us to ensure that we are present when projects are designed, when we are planning the way we are going to implement them, when we are going to mobilize forces to implement them, and when they are implemented in the field, and when they are assessed too, to see whether we know what we can do and to include that in what is being done by the groups in order to mobilize this finance and in order to do the work in the field. I think that it is really important for us to develop other forms of partnership which are mutually beneficial between us. It is important, and the scope of the range of the projects internationally. Sometimes there are international organizations who operate in our countries. Sometimes it is the ministries within our countries who implement these different projects, and we need to ensure that we work with them to find the way to work with them and for them to listen to us and associate us from the start of the project as contributors. We have seen that this is possible recently, to negotiate with them to help with the implementation of projects, because the green funds for climate enable us to work with different project partners in these projects to implement them and ensure that we are implementation partners, because they are required to implement the projects from the point of view of the different groups. So it's a gender plan in every project which is implemented now, and we need to help them to carry out the work and to do the work within our organizations. These are the questions we are working within our organizations. We have the expertise necessary to be able to work on these projects, and in order to use some of the finance which is available for these projects and use them to implement and include people with respect to climate questions as well as environmental questions and finance at that level there. In terms of the African Group for Climate, we have started now to work on a product that has been in place since January, and we have started to hold meetings on a monthly basis now, and every month, at the end of every month, we have reports available. We have approximately 23 countries represented, and these are held in English thus far, because we have a strong English-speaking presence within our groups, and the French-speaking members are lucky enough to be bilingual. So the meetings are held in English, but now we have decided to hold from the 5th of September a second French-speaking group to have meetings, particularly in French-speaking groups, to find out what is happening in their countries, because we have decided to see observations and coordination at country level, but everything is happening at country level. The projects are developed at country level, and they are tracked and evaluated, and everything that we need to organize has to also be done at country level. We have now decided, therefore, within the group to have leaders to coordinate these groups in order to encourage people to act more and to have greater organization of women within these processes. And in Nigeria, in Togo as well, we have a coordinator in Konibali. Since we're talking about gender questions, clearly men can support these questions and can also be engaged in these questions and to coordinate the Mali group. And the Southern African group in Tanzania is Maria, who coordinates it. And then we have different people in Ghana and Miriam in Uganda. We have other people who are candidates for Senegal and other countries who are going to be approved soon to lead their groups. Within the groups, we all have also decided to create an Excel file where we can describe what is happening in each country in terms of climate. So who are the members of the board, who is the national authority, and what are the projects which have been financed within the country, and how much finance, how the implementation is taking place, and other questions. So this information is now contained in an Excel file, which you can see you will get the link in the presentation document. Since we have started this work, it has been done above all free by different members who are supporting this process. And the question of finance is an important question. which is becoming more and more important at country level, because without resources it is difficult to work, without finance it is difficult to work. We have good ideas, but to transform them into projects and implement them for no money, it is very difficult. So we have decided at group level that we must start to find resources to organize ourselves better at regional level, because that has not been done thus far, but also to support the implementation of the different countries in order to support this process. It also requires resources to do the work, but we have also got the opportunity to contribute and to give our observations on the project, because these are implemented using different mechanisms, and it is possible for civil society to give feedback, and people have the opportunity to give feedback on the questions which concern them. And we can use those to prepare a finance document. For example, to prepare a document on the finance and a technical document, but you need time to read these documents and then to consider and to give feedback on these documents, which also takes time, and we need resources to share the information and the feedback. In order to take part in the meetings, we also need to travel, and that takes time, and engagement is all now at a high level, and this cost needs to be covered in one way or another. That is why the question of resources is very important for us, as well as the availability of our contacts and their ability to listen to us when we approach them. In terms of the designated national authority or the members of the committee who represent Africa within the different groups, in order to be able to listen to us. We will continue in this way because perseverance is very important, and it is also important for our actions to become more than just specific actions, and for them in fact to be continuous activities, a continuous initiative, because we currently have a small amount of finance, and if you do not have any finance, then because it is withdrawn, it no longer has an impact. So we need to continue to reflect in order for it to continue. So we are going to continue with our engagement, as well as trying to find ways to enable us to continue, because it is important to continue with what we have started in Africa, but also in a certain number of countries, because lots of things are happening currently in our countries in terms of finance. Lots of projects have started, but the women's organizations are not up to date with what is happening because they are not part of the system which shares this information with them. So it is important to become groups like ours, members of groups like ours, and to persevere, because there are lots of groups who do things around this process on climate finance, and this engagement is important in order to ensure that the questions that we are examining, what are important to us, the questions of gender, to see what is done by these different institutions to address inequalities in order to see the results. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to hand back to Dan, who is coordinating the process, and I hope I will be able to come back to talk to you about the questions that are coming up in our groups. Thank you, Dan, and back to you.
It's a bit abrupt. Apologies for that. There were some questions for you, Masan, and I would like to address them. But before we do, you talk about the importance of why that national engagement is very keen. My question to you would be, how did you get to know that? Why is this the case? So that's the first question. Second question, let me take three questions. The second question is from Elaine Zuckerman. Might the new Francophone group include or be willing to include participants from Haiti, which you know resembles African countries more than it does its neighbors? So that's a great question from Elaine, thank you. And the third question is from Alberta Greta, I hope I pronounced it correctly. And she's curious to know if there's a champion from African countries in working in partnership with CSOs in submitting projects, for example. So over to you. Could you answer these questions, Masan?
So the third question, I'm not really sure I understood that properly. I'll start with the first two and then I'll give you the opportunity to ask the question again. So with regards to engagement at the national level, as I explained, I started as an activist at the national level. I was managing an organization, a Pan-African organization in Togo, and then I joined the board and I created a number of women's organizations in French-speaking Africa. We worked a lot at the national and regional level as well as the international level. With regards to the question that focuses on national engagement, well, everything is done at the country level, to be perfectly understood. So we have to do all the drafting work at the national level because they are designated national authorities, which are the official representatives of the GFVF. And so we have to work with the state. So for each project that is submitted to for funding for the GCF, we need to involve the state. So it's really key to make sure that everybody understands that everybody needs to work in a coordinated manner in order to have a successful implementation of the project. So the impact of this project for the population at the local level will be immense. That's why we have to ensure that the country gives its green light for the implementation of the project. So, and for that, we need to have the signature of the political authorities, and you have to understand that small organizations at the civil society level faced with a lot of difficulties in order to be able to put forward projects and to obtain authorization and then to implement them. So very often we have to deal with international banks, with the UN agencies, but it's very important to understand the channels, the funding channels, in order to make sure that the funds arrive to our country. Sometimes the ministries of our countries have to qualify in order to obtain these fundings. So it's very important that we have a coordinated work. We need to consult the representative of the civil society organizations while we are waiting for the projects to get the green light. And that's very important. While we are waiting, and it's also important that we involve them during the tracking segment of that project. It's important that they are involved at every step of the way, because you can't just react at the very end to complain that you didn't obtain the results that you expected. So we need to also disseminate the information to the local population to make sure they are informed about what we are trying to do for them. So the coordinators that coordinate the projects at the country level are the focal points for the Green Climate Fund in our countries. So we have representatives at the board level who are there, and we are involved at the approval level. We are really the starting point, because we can orientate the project and make sure that the funds are diverted in the manner that we think is put to best use. So at the moment, we are trying to involve more French-speaking countries. I've explained that, and very often these people have come from African descent, and they feel more connected to us than, for example, external observers. For example, in the case of my colleague who will be taking the floor, she'll be expressing herself in Spanish, and I think it's really key that we involve more French-speaking members in order to relay the information with Maria Julia, for example, as well, who is trying to coordinate the Latin American countries, because we'll have, for example, specific project that will take place in Haiti. We will be interested in the French-speaking countries' experience. So it'll be key to make sure that we involve all these parties and that they also feel part of the Latin American group as well as the African French-speaking group. So we have to cover the three regions. We are establishing a network that will involve Latin America, Africa and Asia Pacific, and we're fully dedicated to make sure that we give the best of ourselves to this networking initiative. Now I'll give the floor to my colleague who will make another presentation now. Thank you.
Just to acknowledge, there's a question from Eljoma Ladele, which we will refer to later when we do the end of the wrap-up. There's some more space for questions. So thank you, Massan, for this great presentation and for this insight. Not to waste any time, I would like to go over to Argentina, which somebody got up really early, and we're really happy that she did, and that is Mrs. Maria Julia Tramutola, and she's the Director of International Development of FARN, and that's Foundation for Environment and Natural Resources. So
Buenos días a todos. Mi nombre es María.
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Maria Julia Tramutola. I'm Director of FAR Foundation Environment and Natural Resources, FARN. And I would like to talk, first of all, to explain what was the first reason that made me and motivated me to be involved in questions related to gender and climate change. It was the summit of Rio Plus 20, where an event was presented, directed by women, and this is the future that we women want. It was a very inspiring event for me, and there I understood and I embraced the vision of women having a key role to play in the change of paradigm. And also because we have to take on leadership in questions of climate change and also taking care of our environment. The question of climate financing is not a minor question, and it's very important, as my colleague Massan was saying, in order to implement the ideas and different initiatives and to count on the adequate financing. In this sense, climate finances is very important for all the women of Latin America and all over the world, so they're able to implement the different solutions related to environmental and climate change issues in their own communities. I'm not going to dwell on the concept, but I would like to give you a general idea. During the last summit, which took place in Sonda, for example, a report explained that we have $410 billion invested in climate finance between 2015 and 2016 from a world perspective, including all types of finances and investments. We don't know how much it went into women or how much is specifically gone into projects financed by a woman or under the leadership of women. We do have a number which is 0.2 of the percentage of the funds which are specifically invested in women and climate change. These numbers give us an idea of the percentage of women who are receiving this type of climate finance for their projects. We're also working in a very specific project in our working group in climate finance, and refer to this GARN climate project. And together with Masan and my colleagues who have introduced Masan and their specific region from a Latin American perspective, what we're doing is, on the one hand, we are trying to create a regional group in which we will share tools and information referred to GSF with Regional Women's Groups Network. We have data collection, requirements, problem solving, and our intention is to reach from the group of Latin American women the different questions related to climate financing. We are also working in creating a consultancy directory on gender and climate change in the region. And from a local point of view, but maybe from a more general perspective, we want to be aware of the problem. And for this, we are working in networking at a local level from articles, and we're introducing the gender issue in the different groups working on climate change from a regional perspective. Also, our work in the Green Climate Fund is, as Masan has already explained, from the group of observers of civil society. We try to focus on following very closely the different questions related to gender. This means to carry out the different actions related to gender by each one of the proposals that is that's being presented from a regional perspective. In our case, the different gender plan actions and gender analysis related to Latin America. And in this point, I would like to highlight the importance of collaborating with different groups of Latin America and their feedback, different organizations of women related to climate change, in order to obtain references and opinions which are clear enough in order to understand whether these problems that we are talking about is pertinent enough, about questions related to who are the actors of the civil society, and also whether the problems related to gender is a problem in a specific place or location. As I'm going to say later, it is true that there are some problems from a regional perspective which are very much alike, but some of them are very different from a cultural perspective, and they also have very local characteristics which make them very difficult to be resolved. I would also like to share with you during this conference the fact that last week I was working in the Climate Week for Latin America and the Caribbean at Montevideo, also with the idea of bringing the question of gender to the different debates on climate change. And it was very interesting to encounter some of the initiatives which are already happening in the region related to the subject. I think that this issue is gathering momentum in Latin America. As you can see, in our program, we're working in different regions. Here you have the presenters for today and the different tools that we're using in order to work. On the one hand, we have this series of webinars. On the other hand, it is also our intention to produce different tools and materials in different languages. As Masan was saying, also language is not a minor question. All the materials which are produced in the Green Fund for Climate is in English. In Latin America, most of the groups speak Spanish, and this can be a barrier. So with this program, we are trying to solve this problem and to remove this linguistic barriers from a local or regional perspective in order to be involved in this process of financing. And the third tool that we have are the local groups of women from a regional perspective. What can we say about what we do? Let me tell you what do we analyze when we take a look at this gap of each one of the proposals. Each proposal which is presented in the Green Climate Fund poses a specific solution for a climate problem or climate issue, and it has to present an analysis and an action plan. We take a look at this action plan from a gender perspective, and we take a look at the relevance and coherence with the problem. We want it to be related to the problem. We wanted to show commitments in terms of amounts and budget allocated. We wanted to aim for real change, and this is also an important part because sometimes these action plans related to gender are included within a specific proposal, but not very much involved from the beginning, so we need a change of perspective. And also, we take a look at the different organizations in charge of the implementation of these plans, whether we can gather information about if these organizations are prepared to do it. And this is why we place importance on the involvement of local groups in this part of the project. Why do I think it's so important to carry out this work? Because in my perspective, climate change is offering a very important opportunity to women groups in order to be involved. First, because I'm highly convinced that we women are leaders in this process, and we have to be involved in order to contribute with necessary solutions for this change. And secondly, because it's a reality. It's a reality that many policies and action plans are happening in different working groups and different countries from national contributions, and also because we're touching on financing tools, and this is an excellent opportunity to include gender perspective as a transversal axis in this new paradigm that we are building. And this is why I think that if we can achieve the implementation of these actions, including gender perspective, in a solid way, with an expert perspective, and also with people involved who are able to understand what's happening on the terrain, the responses to climate change, and also to the question of inequalities in the region, can also have a solution, a very much important solution, and real, and to shorten the times that we need in order to reach the different changes that we need in order to face these two questions, the ones of climate change and also the ones of inequalities.
So both issues. Which are the main challenges we are facing? I would love all women in Latin American countries would be fighting, and because this and listening to us with attention. I would like to engage all of them through this webinar. So one of the main challenges is the need for disaggregated data, generally speaking. When we need to assess different initiatives, there is a scarcity of good practices. We need to work cross-cuttingly. We need specialists. There is a lack of experts in issues regarding gender and climate change. And the indicators we have at our disposal are, scarce too, are inefficient and insufficient to measure a transformational change. We need to, to do away with cultural barriers, with existing stereotypes and gender roles. Women's groups are not part of the debates, discussions. They are not present in sufficient numbers, so we need to collaborate and to involve ourselves much more. So next, which are the main learnings, opportunities, experience we've gathered in the last months since we implemented this project? The design of climate change policies poses a great opportunity to reduce the gender gap. We women must be leaders in this change of paradigm. It is absolutely essential, as my colleague Masan, it is necessary to take part in planification and implementation of policies and different initiatives. We need more commitment and involvement on the part of women's groups. What can we do right now? Well, first of all, we want to bring everybody's voice, women's voices, to the review groups. We want to share information on local issues, on everything having to do with gender issues and climate change. If you are currently involved in groups of women, please do include environmental issues in the agenda. We must promote and endeavor to foster leadership vision of women in environmental issues, share experiences and group good practices, collect information, data disaggregated by gender, build success stories with metrics, and promote women, ask women to join spaces of climate finance, negotiations, etc., etc. As I said before, climate change poses a great opportunity to include the gender perspective in the policies and initiatives. This is a chance we cannot reject. We need to take into account that it is absolutely essential to reduce the gender gap in the region, to work for gender equality, equal opportunities, equal rights for everybody, and raise the awareness about the need to revert the situation, to change things for good. So that's all on my part. It's been a real pleasure to be able to share with you and to get to know what you are all doing in different parts of the world. So I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you might have, and I give the floor back to Dan. Muchas gracias, María. Gracias por haberse atenido al tiempo asignado. También hay preguntas para María, por supuesto. Voy a empezar. Unas de López Pereira. Nos dicen, nosotros trabajamos en Brasil. Es más un comentario la segunda que una pregunta. Me acabo de perder, perdón. Me preocupa la falta de especialistas, de técnicos, expertos en cuanto a cambio climático y sí, desde luego no es una pregunta. El género está muy mal representado en los espacios relacionados con las negociaciones sobre las finanzas climáticas, aunque muchos de ellos están familiarizados con la gestión de proyectos en este ámbito. Thank you, John. Could you please repeat the first question, because it's not very clear. I give the floor back to you so that you can repeat it, please. Estaba en español, mi español no es tan bueno. Sí, sobre el segundo punto. Sí, estaba de acuerdo en la falta de expertos técnicos. Bien, y cedo la palabra a María, si estás de acuerdo. Sí. I do not have a response, but I have a concern. Maybe you could, the person, the attendant can write to me, write an email to me. Maybe in my presentation, I didn't mention it when I made reference to the challenges. So all the people that are involved in these issues, please do write an email to me, or because we want to add up experiences and to build on knowledge and expertise that are essential to achieve fundamental change, because we have built up all the capabilities needed. I don't know whether there was another question. I give the floor back to Dan.
The other question related to who you work with in Brazil, but I think that we can continue and you can talk to that person when you get in touch with them later on. Yeah, so thank you very much, Maria, for your great presentation. I just heard there's storm and thunder in Thailand at the moment, but we're still going to try and connect with our last speaker of the day, and that is Wanun Prepimul. I'm pronouncing it wrong, so I hope she corrects me in the next few seconds. Wanun is Director of Climate Watch Thailand, and she will take the floor hopefully now.
Good evening from Thailand. My name is Wanan Permpiboon, and I'm very happy to share the experiences of engaging in the climate finance. My organization has, I'm just clicking into, sorry. Climate Watch Thailand has been engaging in climate issues for more than 10 years. And at first, we've been engaging in the mitigation side, more on the energy issues and also on the adaptation issues. Climate finance at that time, we were not so put a lot of focus onto it. But we are putting a bit of more focus on looking at the projects of the MDB, the multilateral banks like the World Bank and the ADB, because they were having projects in Thailand and also the neighboring countries. So and that's how we were kind of merging the two issues of the work on climate change that we have been working on during that time, and also engaging with the MDBs and looking at what they are doing in terms of the investing on the climate finance. And the thing that I'm showing in my presentation is to look at the facts that climate change is really, really a real threat, and communities are already impacting impacts on the ground. And if you look at the Paris Agreement and also the contributions and also the targets that each country is pledging and also is going to implement in terms of reducing the emissions, it's going to lead us away to 3.5 degrees Celsius. As of the current temperature increase from the pre-industrial era, we are at 1.1 degrees Celsius. And with 1.1 degrees Celsius increase, we have seen a number of communities at risk, and more communities would be even more vulnerable if we still continue emitting. And if the Paris Agreement is going to put the temperature increase to 1.5 to even 2 degrees, so we will really, really need to do more, and that would also need finance onto it. And also the other thing that gets us to focus more on the climate finance is that coal-fired power plant, which is one form of the fossil fuels, is going to be remained in this region in Southeast Asia. If you can see the first one here, by 2011, there were 600 power plants in this region, Southeast Asia. And then by the end of 2030, if you follow the SDG or Sustainable Development Goals, by the end of the Sustainable Development Goals, or by the end of 2030, the number of coal-fired power plants in this region in Southeast Asia is going to be even nearly double. So it would be like 1,000 power plants in this region. So and that means it's how are we going to achieve 1.5 and how are we going to take care of those communities who are at risk? And then what gets us also involved in the climate finance is impacts are already there, but the impacts are not really distributed equally. So the most vulnerable one would be having less access to the finance for addressing the impacts, or even like to build their resilience and the long-term adaptation. So this process that would strengthen the capacity of those who are the most vulnerable would need the finance. And also, as I said, the world is gearing to an increasing temperature increase to like more than 3 degrees, and we need to reduce temperature. So you would see that renewable sources of energy would be the solution to the climate change. That is to replace coal and fossil fuels. But there are a number of renewable energy projects that have been overlooked environmental and ecological and social and gender aspects into those projects, even though they are renewables, but these aspects are ignored. So we really need to ensure that all the finance have to respond to these and have these aspects into their implementation. And also particular for Thailand and some of the Mekong countries, when we are talking about the impacts of like large projects and large investments, we are talking about the local impacts. So we kind of really need to engage more groups rather than the usual environmental groups. We need to expand the audience into a new group. So we are thinking about the new narratives around the finance. For example, like whose money is investing on the coal-fired power plant, and then we would like to also engage in the accountability issues, and that's why we see that the climate finance is really the key in order to put in the new narrative. And since joining this work with VDU and both N, we have been trying to engage different groups who've been working on different issues. We started with engaging the climate finance and the GCF discussions with different groups who are already working and monitoring the work of the MDBs, like the World Bank and AIIB and the ADB. So the objective is to make them aware that the climate finance is also part of the work of the MDB. And most of the MDB are now looking and investing more on the projects that would be logo or be branded as the climate projects. And we are building and also communicating in terms of the profiles of these MDBs, the multilateral banks, as they are engaged in the climate finance and the Green Climate Fund. For example, you have accredited entities who are preparing for proposals and projects to be submitted and to get approved by the GCF. These are, for example, like World Bank and ADB. So it's kind of starting from the work of the existing networks who are already tracking and monitoring the work of the financial institutions, so that we hope that could also get their engagement more into the climate finance and the GCF. And also before the board meetings, we were sharing information to these groups and then trying to develop channels for these groups to provide comments to the GCF proposals, because you know that a number of projects and proposals have been submitted to the GCF, and those projects are, for example, located in different countries. So you really need to create a network and also a strong channel for these networks in those countries to provide comments. And also we would like to integrate, what we have done is also to integrate climate finance into different forums. Whenever there are opportunities of talking about finance or even climate change, we integrate the GCF and also the work on the climate finance and the GCF into those forums, so that people are aware of the climate finance. And also we're trying to establish a strong channel to share and update the climate finance, especially the GCF, to the already existing groups that we have been talking with. And So what are the value and also the benefits of engaging in the climate finance? So for us, as developing countries and those countries in Southeast Asia and the Asia Pacific, we are the most vulnerable to impacts of climate change. So there is really need to raise the issue of urgency of climate change. And also we really want to advocate for a big paradigm shift in the climate finance. It's not going to be business as usual investment, but it has to produce a very big paradigm shift in terms of investments and also the finance. And there is also really need to ensure that projects and proposals and those projects implementation on the ground need to reflect the climate justice. So that means they have to engage and also to ensure that the benefits of the project and those projects benefits are distributed to those who are the most vulnerable and also the women's group. And the finance raised a question of whose finance is investing. So some of those finance are coming from our government and our financial institutions that is located within our country. So we need to hold them accountable. The money that we put in the bank, for example, or the tax that we are paying the government, it has to be accountable to us. So we really need to ensure and make our voices heard to them, that we are watching them and we want them to use the money to respond to our needs. And by Climate Watch Thailand and our networks are also working with the local communities and those vulnerable to impacts of climate change. So we're trying to bring the voices of and the concerns of the locals and the marginalized and women's groups to be heard at all levels. And also, as you might be aware, the MDB, the multilateral bank, the MDBs are trying to phase out financing coal and fossil fuels, but they haven't been talking and keeping track on the intermediaries like IFIs. So we really need to keep track in terms of who are those IFI and what kind of projects they are financing, in order to make sure that the finance is used for the transition, a just transition. And for us, the challenge of engaging into this is we really need to bring in more people and more NGOs and more CSOs into the discussion, especially at the national level, because the national government and also together with those consultants who are preparing for the project, they would submit the project to the banks and also to the GCF. So we really need to ensure that those projects are done with our comments and also with our engagement. And also what is really important is to monitor those projects that will be implemented on the ground, and also to ensure that grassroots and also women's groups and those who are the most vulnerable are having the direct access to the finance. These people are working on the ground and they are impacted by the impacts of climate change and sometimes by the development projects. We need to ensure that they have the access to the finance in order to do projects according to their needs. And also, we really need to put this climate change, that it is really an urgency in terms of climate change. It's not just like if a country would do a small amount of renewable energy, but they are doing a big amount of coal. I mean, we really need to raise the issue of urgency. So it's not about marginalized renewable sources of energy, but you really need to shift and to make a paradigm shift that respond to the urgency of climate change. And that paradigm shift needs to contribute to the policy change towards a just transition. And the last one would be on the challenge on the capacity building needs. So if you look at a country level, government and also the accredited entities would be preparing for project proposals. And normally they would ask like the AE or the consultant to do the work. So all the guidelines of the GCF and also all the MDBs would be learned and also understood by the consultant. So the capacity lines with the consultants rather than lying with the national institutions. So in that case, when it gets into the implementation, those idea and those understanding doesn't really translate into the work of the government, because most of the work are lying with the consultant. And my last slide would be what we think in terms of like would be the next step of our work. So for us, and to me, the national engagement is really the key, because the government will be preparing for project and proposal to be submitted to the banks and also to the GCF. So we really need to have the national mechanism or platform in order to ensure the national CSOs and local CSOs and grassroots engagement in the national planning process. We have seen that the powerful institutions like MDB and also ADB and the World Bank are having all the capacity to access the GCF. So we would continue tracking the finance from these institutions to ensure that they make a shift and paradigm shift. And I put a number of focus more on the paradigm shift, because we think that with the paradigm shift, we need to reflect the urgency of the issue of climate change. It's not going to be a business as usual. The finance from the GCF should gear towards a just transition, not just only repeating whatever projects that would be there even without the Green Climate Fund support. So it has to ensure that it leads to a shift in the policy direction and also towards a just transition. So once the project is approved, it gets into project implementation on the ground. So we still need to monitor the project on the ground, and then it would be great to share these cases. And also, we will be trying to strengthen the regional advocacy channel and network so that these people are participating and also engaging in the GCF discussion and the climate finance policy discussion. And also regional exchanges would be really helpful, because it would also share experiences on the ground and also the regional advocacy work that CSOs have been doing. So with that, I end my presentation, and I'm very happy to hear the questions. Over to you, Dan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Wanun, also for staying up so late for us, and it's never too late to acknowledge it. I just had one specific question for you, and then after that we can open the floor for broader comments and questions. You mentioned that you had a couple of exchanges with accredited entities and national designated authorities in the GCF. Could you share something about how did that go? Was that effective? And do you have any tips going forward? Back to you, Wanun.
Thank you for the question, Dan. If I hear it correctly, because the sound is kind of shaking and broken. So I think it's the question is more on the accredited entities and also the consultants who've been engaging in preparing for the proposal at the national level. So in that case, I would think that the experiences from my engagement in the GCF is they are the same business as usual. For example, the ADB would be doing the same projects even without the GCF money. Some of the projects that I have been reviewing before it gets to get approved by the board meeting, it was, for example, like even though without the money from the GCF, the project could go ahead. So for us, it doesn't really lead to paradigm shift. Some of the projects are something like the cook stove, for example. So in some countries, the cook stove is already, a number of cook stoves are already there, but the project is still, the GCF is still supporting the cook stove project. I even talked to some of the local NGOs where that cook stove project is going to be implemented. They were saying that the cook stove has been there for like more than 10 years. And then as of now, rural communities and rural households are owning like 3 to 4 cook stoves in the rural area. So why the GCF is still financing the what I call as business as usual project rather than going ahead with something that would shift to something that would shift to a big shift in terms of the paradigm, in terms of the development. I hope that answers that. Over to you, Dan.
Yes, thank you, Wanun, for that answer. I think we can go on to the more general question section, and we have some great questions. And one I would like to pose to Masan is, and that is from Tamjong Eni Nye Punje, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. And she asks, how feasible is it for resources to be allocated not only to women, but specifically to rural women who are highly marginalized for several fronts because of ignorance, low self-esteem, and cultural malpractices? Masan, would you be able to answer that? Over to you, Masan.
La plupart de ces financements, c'est pas possible pour les individus pouvoir les recevoir. Et ça, en tant qu'organisation.
Yes, Dan, I believe what is important to know is that most of these funding is not very often possible for these individuals to receive them. It very much depends on organization of civil society. That's why we create NGOs in order to set up projects and look for funding in order to implement those specific projects. So for these organizations to access funding, there are currently a lot of existing opportunities that enable us to obtain funding to implement those projects. But for most of those Green Climate Fund or the Adaptation Fund are all very important funds, and very often the organizations cannot qualify, are not eligible for this type of finance or funding. So a number of organizations can access these funds, but they need to be able to understand the mechanisms in order to have access to this funding. But for the larger funds, we really need to adopt a different strategy and to see how these organizations can qualify directly, or whether they should tap into other mechanisms in order to access these funds in a different way. For example, for the Green Climate Fund, the qualifying process is extremely complex, as you may know, and at the moment it's the World Bank or the BOAD, the African Development Bank, who are in charge of these funds. So some organizations on our continent have managed to qualify, and when they become eligible to present this project, then they're able to draft the whole project and submit an application for funding. But a number still of organizations cannot qualify directly. And so what they could do is to partner with the ones who have qualified and work with them in, as a consultant, for example, or as a partner, in order to participate whenever they are already in the process of applying. And so, for example, some organization communicate when they have drafted a conceptual note in order to invite other partners to take part. But the easiest way to qualify is to talk to the NDA, and we are usually well informed and can advise you and tell you when it is necessary to kickstart the process in order to benefit from these opportunities and to have access to these funding opportunities.
If Masan was already done, maybe we should go to back to Masan for a bit.
So yes, I had finished, but I wanted to extend a bit on the opportunities, the question of opportunities. Many organizations are faced with difficulties, and they are very often misinformed. They don't know how to have access to this funding. They need to be able to join certain networks and to network with these different groups. Even though you're not at the root of the source of information, very often the information is communicated indirectly and it's by hearsay. So it's important to sign up to distribution lists in order to hear about these opportunities. So at the moment we are accepting registration for the African network. We also accept registration for the tracking part of the projects and for the follow-up. So even though you are not a coordinator of the group, you can also be part of the national group and you can join the movement in this way. Because if you remain isolated, you will have access to very limited resources. So that's why it's really key for you to integrate this wider movement. That's why we want to launch this wider network to try to stimulate more collaboration through both ends. And beyond this project, we want to make sure that the engagement is perpetuated on a wider scale, if I may say.
But I think we get the body of your answer. So thank you very much. Maybe I have the feeling we're throwing around a lot of terms and definitions here. Just to clarify, we have a couple of webinars, as I mentioned earlier, where you can check what an accredited entity is, what a national designated authority is, what a direct access means and what international access means. Those terms came back a couple of times, but just to be very short. So within the GCF, there's a board that takes decisions, and at every national level, the projects are prepared, and that can be, or they are not only prepared but approved, as in a national designated authority should give no objection to every project in the country. So that's why the national designated authority is very important as a ally to focus your lobby and advocacy on. Well, there's direct access and international access. International access means, and that's what Wanoon referred to as the business as usual big channels of climate finance, like the World Bank, like UNDP, like UNEP, but also less favorable parties like the Deutsche Bank, for example, or HSBC. So that is the international section. And then you have a possibility in the GCF of a direct access entities. And those are institutions, and that can be CSOs, that can be MDBs, small businesses, small medium businesses. That get accredited to the GCF, and they work from the country only in that country. So I wanted to clarify that that part. I hope that is a bit clear, but otherwise, please look at our previous webinars where we explain the basics of that. So I see a lot of comments on, well, interest of contacting our three speakers of today. We'll make sure that every information will be shared, all the emails and the possibilities to engage with them. And we're really happy that there's so much interest for that. So thank you very much for that. To conclude this session, I would like to give the floor to our speakers of today to have 2 minutes to a concluding remark or something that was got their attention of this meeting today. So maybe I could give the floor first to Massan. She could, give her last 2 minutes of thoughts of today. So back to you, Massan.
Voir l'engagement des francophones dans ce processus, je crois que c'est extrêmement important.
Thank you very much, Dan. I will pursue in French in order to prove
En este proceso. Me parece que
French-speaking members. I think engagement is really key. Within this project, we need to underline the fact that that Danny here was the only man that was represented. So women really need to take an active role with regards to the promotion of women's rights, also with regards to climate finance specifically. Nothing should remain neutral with regards to the gender question. Whatever the project may be, even if this has not been done intentionally to bridge the gap between the different genders, women are adversely affected by the implementation of these projects, unfortunately. And very often they are adversely affected, as I said, in a negative way. So, or it could be that they are impacted by different actions. So it's very important for the women's group to look into this question, and for the activists who are there to defend, to lobby for women's rights, they need to take interest into climate change and climate finance, because very often our entire community is impacted by climate change and they are adversely affected. Populations cannot directly react to these effects. We are here to represent them and to raise these questions on their behalf. And that's why the group who works on the question of gender has to follow the funding process for climate funding. We have specific groups that are interested in this question as well. So I can only insist that you need to take an active role and to join our movement, because if we do not do that ourselves, nobody will do it for us. We need to persevere and do this in a continuous fashion and make sure that it's something that is durable in order to obtain positive results. That needs to be a sustained action. It's very important to support what we are doing, and much in the same way as the Asian or Latin American group, the African group is very much open to any contributions. We would like to welcome you to take part. For those of you who could not watch the entire webinar, I would like to encourage you to watch the recording of this webinar, and we will share our email details with you so you can continue and support us and take an active part, whether it be by signing up to the different distribution lists or to take an active part in the movement. I'll give the floor back to Dan on these few words.
Not to waste any time, maybe we can go to Maria Julia for some ending remarks. Back to you, Maria Julia.
Muchas gracias, Dan.
Yes, thank you very much, Dan. Just to conclude, I would like to highlight a couple of things. One, let me repeat my conviction that this is a great opportunity ahead of us for women to have a role of leadership, to offer solutions, to involve ourselves from different perspectives and different sectors where we are working, and also from the different organizations that work from the baseline. Another thing that I would like to highlight is that during the week of climate for Latin America and questions of gender, everybody said that it was very pertinent to gather the ancestral knowledge of women to the roundtables where solutions are being prepared and designed. And the last remark is that all this cannot be done from an individual perspective. We require networking, working in groups, collaborations. So I share with Masan the fact of welcoming all those groups of women and organizations that want to join our group of Latin America. And together, I have no doubt that we will be able to offer solutions to different problems of climate change in the region, and also to build a new leadership with new knowledge. As I said, databases is not a problem but a challenge. and I'm sure that we will be able to solve it. Dan, I give you the floor.
And let me go over to the stormy Thailand, to Wanun. Wanun, can you take the floor?
My two remarks before ending is GCF is not just like the normal bank. It is basically the fund for climate only. So we really need to make sure that it responds to really the needs and also a paradigm shift. It's not business as usual. And the second one is Asia Pacific CSOs are already engaged in a number of issues. So when you're talking about climate finance, it might not get a lot of interest, but I mean, it just people are really interested in trying to get engaged as well. So I would think that we really, a big challenge on that would be trying to set up a mechanism among the Asia Pacific CSOs so that they can bring the voices from the ground to be heard at the regional and also the national level. So in that case, I mean, a number of projects could also be monitored and also could also be prepared by engaging them in the project preparation. So that, with that, I end my answer. Over to you, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you, Wanun. And that leaves me, we're actually already ahead of time. Let me thank you all for being here and bearing with us. It is challenging to organize such a webinar where we have different time zones and different languages all together. So I'm happy that it somehow worked. Thank you all for being with us today, and a big thank you to our speakers, some who got up really early, some who stayed up really late. So we really appreciated of that. I just wanted to remark that all information and the recording of this webinar will be posted on WeDo's website, and we'll also share it via email after this. So this wraps up the first part of our webinar series. We had 5, like I mentioned before. Please be welcome to watch them again and to ask questions if you need clarification. And we will evaluate and then we'll communicate shortly in the coming months on how to continue and how to move forward. But we are aiming for organizing more webinars. So again, thank you very much for being here, and I wish you all a good day or a good evening. And back to you, Peter.
Yes, thank you, Dan. So this concludes the session. I think that went really well. Thanks to the organizers, thanks to the speakers. So all you have to do now is close your browser window, or on the left-hand side in the black box, you click the square the arrow to disconnect. I will end the meeting now. So, and as said, the recording will be available shortly. Thank you so much for participating.